Hey everyone, welcome to Security Practices for Windows Virtual Desktop Environments. Today we're going to talk about all the security controls that you have available to make Windows Virtual Desktop even more secure. Now it's a masterclass of about 30 minutes, so we'll give you the high-level pointers. There's definitely some homework if you want to look into what kind of options you have available. Some of these might be super easy to implement. Some others might require a little bit more designing. But hopefully, in the next 30-ish minutes, we can educate you on everything that's available to increase the security posture of your WVD environment. My name is Pieter. I'm a PM in the Windows Virtual Desktop team. Sitting virtually next to me is Paul. Paul, could you quickly introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Happy to be here. Thanks, Peter. My name is Paul, and I'm a PM for Microsoft Defender for Endpoint.
Great. And thanks for joining us, Paul. Today's agenda. So we're going to spend 1 minute to very quickly talk about the Windows Virtual Desktop architecture. And I'm sure that many of you are already familiar with what Windows Virtual Desktop is and how it works, just high level. So I'm going to blaze through this. And next, we're going to talk about shared responsibility. Now, with a lot of Microsoft cloud services, Microsoft manages part of the solution, and we also offer lots of flexibility. And typically, flexibility also comes with responsibility. So we'll talk about that. Now, the majority of our time together, we'll be talking about the end-to-end security for virtual desktops. We'll walk through several pillars that will explain you what kind of controls are available to, like mentioned before, to increase the security posture of your deployment. With that, let's dive in. So let's talk about the Windows Virtual Desktop architecture for just a minute or so. With Windows Virtual Desktop, you can publish either remote apps or full desktops or mix and match. It's totally up to you. And the difference is that instead of working locally, you now are working remotely on a virtual machine that's running in Azure. You can connect using any client for all the major operating systems that are available. So think about Windows, Mac, iOS, Android. We even have an HTML5 client. So as long as you have a browser, you should be able to connect to Windows Virtual Desktop. Now, for those of you who ever deployed an on-premises remote desktop services, RDS environment, I'm sure you remember all the infrastructure that you have to set up before you can even think about an initial connection. So you had to think about, well, first of all, of course, purchasing the physical hardware, and then making sure you have a gateway, broker, diagnostics. So all of these infrastructure components, and everything had to be domain joined, had to be exposed to the internet, which, let's be honest, not everyone on this planet truly loved. So this is no longer the case, and Microsoft takes full ownership of this management plane, and we'll talk about that on the next slide in more detail. We also make sure that it just scales up and down whenever it's needed, so you don't have to think about that load in terms of the infrastructure required. The VMs themselves, they run in your own subscription, and that's based on customer feedback because that offers you the full flexibility. You are still in control of all the session hosts or the virtual machines that are running in your own subscription. So you can use your existing policies and tweak the configuration based on whatever your organization requires. So that's just super high level. Next, we're going to talk about the shared responsibility. So we mentioned the RDS, the on-premises remote desktop services setup. And again, I'm sure you are familiar with what that was in the past. So here you can see specific categories or pillars ranging from identity to end user devices, all the way to the physical data centers, network, and hosts. With on-prem VDI or RDS, you're responsible for everything from start to finish. With Windows Virtual Desktop, Microsoft took ownership of parts of these responsibilities. So if we move from the bottom of the slide up, of course, Microsoft owns the data centers, the network, the hosts. So all of the physical hardware is now managed by Microsoft. So you're no longer in that business. Then the virtualization control plane is what we discussed about a minute ago, which is all about that gateway, broker, diagnostics. That's all managed by Microsoft. So we scale up and down whenever it's needed. And by the way, this is completely redesigned from the ground up. It's no longer domain joined machines that are exposed to the internet. These are all web applications, which just increases the security posture of our virtualization control plane quite a bit. Now, there's still some items which is your responsibility, and you can see them on the slide. And we have many, many controls available to make sure you increase your security. I'll give you an example, and we'll talk about this in depth in the next few minutes. With identity, so typically your username and password, we all know that just a username and password is no longer great security. So with either multi-factor authentication or conditional access, that's one of the controls available to increase your security posture. And again, we'll walk through all of the pillars. As a matter of fact, Paul is going to walk us through all the pillars. So I'm going to hand over to him.
All right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Peter. Just understanding what it is that Microsoft does for you that's in the platform and then really providing that sort of reduction in attack service. It's really good to understand also the things that you are responsible for and that we share responsibility for. There's not just a WVD deployment that you need to think about in context of an end-to-end security approach. We really need to think of it from the device that's being used to access the environment. That might be a variable. Yeah, you might be using a thin client device. You might be using a rich client device that you're also covering. Think about it end to end and make sure that you cover all the bases. From a left to right perspective, identity definitely important pillar. So I'd like to emphasize that a little bit. If you don't have any other control plane, and that's definitely where you need to start thinking. As you can read, we will cover all of these pillars in a little bit more detail during this presentation. I don't think you can do it on one without the other. So make sure that you focus on all of these areas. We have some really helpful tools to help you do that. And as you can see on the right side of the slide, threat protection, analytics, SIEM. Some of the things that are not called out on this slide is how you monitor the overall environment, which should encompass like a broader view as well. It's not just WVD, it's all of the things involved. And please also think about operating systems, not just for Windows Virtual Desktop, but you might be running application servers, domain controllers you need to think about. So from an end-to-end perspective, this is a starting point, and let's move into our next topic. So let me go over the conditional access part a little bit further. This really calls out activate Azure MFA for Azure AD accounts, which is a long way of saying use MFA, use MFA, use MFA. People familiar with Microsoft should have this between their ears already. But to my point earlier, if you cannot control the device that is accessing, you may want to spend some extra time on this. Now, conditional access, which is the second line item, that's actually a really good mechanism to really focus on the zero trust approach. Like, what are the things that I can check before allowing access? And it's not just identity and that second factor, but it might also be like an origin or the device that is connecting. And we have some really cool connections also back to Defender for Endpoint if you want to take sort of the device status into account.
Then one of the things that our customers like to use in order to configure their Windows Virtual Desktop environment is Microsoft Endpoint Manager. And what we announced at Ignite last year is the fact that you can now use MEM for hybrid Azure AD joined Windows Virtual Desktop VMs, specifically Windows 10 Enterprise. So the Windows 10 Enterprise that you're familiar with, it's very likely to also be running on physical devices within your organization. The announcement was that you can use MEM fully supported. So another thing which is very important, and just like Paul mentioned with MFA, this shouldn't be new. Make sure that all of your software, specifically the operating systems, but of course the applications running on top of Windows Virtual Desktop as well, that they're always kept up to date. There's two approaches on how you can do that. If we just focus at the operating system, you can either use controls such as Windows Update for Business or using MEM to make sure that your running VMs are patched on Patch Tuesday or shortly after, just like your physical devices. That's one strategy. The other strategy is redeploy your complete environment a couple of days after Patch Tuesday. You can download or deploy the latest gallery image, and that always is kept up to date. So again, it's Patch Tuesday. You can automatically redeploy your environment with the latest image, and that's one other way of just making sure you're always up to date. Another cool thing which lots of our customers are using is controls to manipulate the device redirection. A great example is copy and paste. So in some high secure environments, you want to make sure that no information is crossed between the endpoint that you use to connect from and the session host that you're connecting to. So you have a very clear security barrier and the data only resides on, let's say, the server side or within your subscription. So on a host pool level, you can disable these redirections. You can see a couple of examples on the slides, like smart card, port, drives, camera redirection. Copy and paste is a very important one as well. Later on, we'll show a quick demo on what that looks like. Another great way to increase your security posture is by looking at the Windows 10 security baselines. You can find them on our download center. One of the questions we get quite often is for Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session, what kind of security baselines should you be looking at? And we recommend to look at the Windows 10 Enterprise security baselines, tweak those or either take them as they are, but see what fits for your organization and deploy those against your Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session VMs. Now, there are many GPOs you can choose from. We talked about that in one of the previous slides. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of GPOs available, but there are two that kind of stand out and that lots of customers are using. There's one that sets the time limit for active but idle sessions. So imagine that I'm working on a remote server, and at the end of the day, I just lock my physical device, but my remote session is still active. Now, it's still active, but maybe I'm no longer working on a given day. And I just signed off, and, I went home, or, back in the days we went home, now we are already home. One of the things you can configure is what kind of time should pass in an idle mode before that session is disconnected. And when it's disconnected, it doesn't mean logged off. So I can still come back in a certain time frame, reconnect to my session, and continue where I left off. On top of that, you can also set a limit for disconnected sessions. And when that limit has reached, we'll log off the session. So if you combine those two, I'll give you a random example where maybe if a session is idle for a minute, we'll disconnect. And then if a session is idle or disconnected for several minutes, or maybe 30 minutes or an hour, we'll log off the user. So these are pretty powerful. And you can make sure that at the end of the day, everyone who's no longer working is logged off. From a security perspective, that's great because you no longer have an active session. But it also, from a cost-saving perspective, can be great because once everyone's logged off, you can just shut down a VM and save costs that way.
Yeah, sounds like a really good idea, Peter, as well. If you have to, get up and leave your desk for any reason quickly, leaving your terminal open, it'd be nice to understand that somehow unauthorized people are, blocked from getting access. Like being able to defend against intrusion, like leaving the door open like that is one of the main concerns, obviously. So in the line of thinking, let's go ahead and dive into this slide. I'm just going to go ahead and take it because it says Defender, Peter. So I think the mindset that we just took, like, okay, what happens if an unauthorized person is able to access my session? The session controls are a great way. If someone needs to run away from their workstation from whatever reason, you can't just ask them to lock. I mean, if they really need to leave, they need to leave, right? So, and there's some really good recent examples that I don't want to dive into, but here from an attacker perspective, there's many ways of gaining access. What happens if an attacker does gain access? Hopefully, Defender for Endpoint can jump in there, either just by detecting what's going on and having that visibility on that machine. Like I mentioned, threat protection and monitoring earlier. If we know that someone is behaving oddly and performing techniques that are not okay, like this is not your office that is running, but it's some sort of malicious script, we want to be able to pick up on that, alert on that, respond to that. And if there's any form of malware or malware-related technique involved, that's where we want our next-gen AV to kick in. So this combination of prevention and protection and response, really strong in our suite today, works beautifully on Windows Virtual Desktop, being another platform where these controls are built in as opposed to added on later. I think a couple of call-outs here. Network protection and web content filtering are asterisked right now. We are right now working on better supporting the general multi-session nature of this environment, and we want to improve things in this area. So we're not quite ready yet to say, oh, okay, go ahead and enable network protection, web content filtering willy-nilly. there's some considerations in there. Normally, you have one user per device active at one given time. Multi-users might mean that you want to see about differentiating policies. It's not quite possible because we operate on a network, on an OS level. So just keep that in mind. We're working on that, trying to bring that to you as soon as possible. That said, we are from the Defender team right now hard at work. In fact, we have been hard at work to have the best visibility for your multi-session environment. And we're ready to provide you more info. By this time, you should be able to consume that information publicly around our multi-session support for Windows Virtual Desktop in Defender. For Endpoint, the last point I want to touch upon, and it's sort of tying back to what Peter said earlier about patching your OS and making sure that it's all up to date, including your applications. Threat vulnerability management, which is a part of this, which you are getting as soon as you onboard your devices, is a really, really strong way of getting visibility on what you should be patching. So not only operating system updates, we will prioritize whatever we think is your number one target. Imagine there is some software from a third party that you're using, and this particular version, there's a vulnerability in it. It happens all the time. But if there's a very low chance that this vulnerability is actively able to exploit, or we actually don't see it out in the wild yet, we might prioritize it differently from threats that are targeted against vulnerabilities in the wild, but also in your environment. Remember, we have the EDR, we have the visibility on this device. So if we can actually tie one and one together and see, hey, this application is being exploited in your environment, let's go ahead and move that to the top of the queue. So that's a really great way of driving what you should be doing at this moment in time. So definitely for the IT department, take a look at this. It's super strong. So next up, we mentioned Defender for Endpoint. We also mentioned applications and application control. We have these two technologies still around. Well, AppLocker is still around. You might be familiar with it. Really what we're saying here, use both if needed. Application control is sort of the way of really making sure that drivers and everything is well secure on an application or driver level. And then diving a little bit deeper, AppLocker, it can control a little bit more fine grade, maybe on a publisher level, and give you some more differentiation between versions of applications if you need that. So these together, obviously very strong. Application control is a good way of ensuring that only allowed software is running. So things like malware are not allowed to run. So, you can really up your game here. It does require a little bit of overhead, I think, from a Windows Virtual Desktop perspective, because you can do this at scale. It's probably a good idea, right? So let's move on to the demo. Peter, let's take a look at some of these things put together.
We've talked about quite a bunch of these security controls. Would be good to just show a few in action. So what we're going to do is we're going to demo conditional access, how to access using our web client, how to get access to a remote app. And by the way, remote app is not a security boundary. We'll talk about that soon. And how AppLocker can make sure that an end user cannot modify this system in any way which is not aligning with your design. So here what I have is a browser. And what I'm going to do is browse to our HTML5 client using the link you can see at the top. What I'm going to do next is just enter my demo account. And of course, I'm being prompted for my password, which I'll just enter here. And the next thing what happens is that I need to approve the sign-in request. And I'm sure you're familiar with it, but on my phone, I now have to confirm my identity. So what I'm doing is I'm launching the Microsoft Authenticator app, which combines facial recognition. And if I successfully pass that additional factor, I'm granted access to my environment. So this means that now I have three factors. One is my passwords, which is something I know. Then it's my phone, which is something I have. And then it's my face, which is something I am. So those three combined will already give you a way ahead of just the typical username and password validation that we've seen historically. Now here I get access to my workspace, which has one high secure LOB app. And I'm sure that based on the icon, you can already tell what kind of application we're expecting here. So what I'm going to do is just open up this high secure application. In this environment, I have not configured single sign-on. So that means I'll be prompted for an additional username and password. And this is just traditional AD authentication that we're doing here. Once I hit submit, and my password's being validated, and if all goes well, I get access to my notepad. You can see that I already had an active session open, so I can just continue where I left off. Now, one thing I'd like to show you is that for this host pool, we disabled the redirection of clipboard. So that means whatever I have on my clipboard in a remote session is completely separated from what I have on my clipboard on my physical device. And just to show you what that looks like, if I grab this text and I right click and I do copy, and now on my physical device, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up Notepad. And just to show you that this is on my physical device, I can overlay it on the browser. So it started locally. And now if I right click, what you'll notice is that something else, which was on my clipboard earlier, which was my username, I just copy and pasted that from a Notepad file to make sure I don't have to type anything for this demo. So that's stored locally on my clipboard. And also the other way around. So if I would copy this text and then go into my remote session, do paste, you can see it's still, this is a test. So it's completely separated. This allows us to make sure that we only transfer pixels. And the data segregation is almost perfect. There is only pixels being transferred. Nothing ends up on the endpoint. So if I lose my device, public transport, or all the great examples out there, no data is being compromised because it's completely separated and stored within my own subscription in our Azure data centers, secure and locked away. So that was a quick demo of some of the technology combined. One thing I'd like to express is remote app is not a security boundary. Remote app is a different shell. So it means it's a different visualization where we don't see the start menu and the complete desktop. We only see the application itself. But there's one thing that I also want to show as part of this demo. If I go back to the client, if I do file open. So look, I'm here in System32. If I go to all files and browse to cmd.exe, I can right click and normally I would be able to open up a CMD. And again, remote app is just a different visualization. It's not a security boundary. However, in this case, if I hit open, you can see that this action is being blocked because my IT admin has deployed an app blocker policy that allows or restricts specific applications. So it's a great way to make sure that no one can tamper with the system and only has access to those applications that are aligned with the organization. So with that, we're going to continue with some of the network controls available. So let's first talk about the reverse connect functionality. This is something part of Windows Virtual Desktop. There's nothing for you to do. This is one of the key investments. So when we started to design Windows Virtual Desktop, we came up with this reverse connect technology. And what that means is that we install a very thin agent that creates an outbound connection to our control plane or our management plane. It's using standardized ports such as TCP 443. It's all encrypted. And it's only that outbound connection that's being made. That's purely for WVD is the only outbound port that needs to be opened. Now, there are a few others in terms of Windows activation, but purely if we look at the remote desktop, that's the only port that's required. Now, the key benefit is that if you as an end user establish a connection to your host pool, that's being originated from your local client up to our management plane. We tie that connection together, very similar like a reverse proxy, and we grant you access to a remote session. So you don't have to open any inbound port. Your VM doesn't even need to have a public IP address. As a matter of fact, by default, if you deploy it, it has a private IP address. So this is one of the great innovations. And together with multi-factor authentication or conditional access, we can make sure that there's no brute force password cracking possible, like we've seen with RDS in the past. So again, basic standard functionality. There's nothing for you to enable it. It's enabled by default. Now, two other investments or controls you can use is the NSG firewall service and the Azure firewall. So depending on your needs, you can enable the NSG firewall. We added service tags, which means that you can go into the Azure portal and add exclusions specifically for WVD by just adding one service tag. Historically, you had to maintain a full list of FQDNs or even IP addresses. We now do that on behalf. So you're no longer in that business. It's much easier. If anything changes, we'll make sure that that service tag is updated with a new FQDN or IP address. If you want to use an Azure firewall, and so instead of offloading all of the traffic to your on-prem environment using your own firewall, you can now use Azure Firewall, which is a cloud-native firewall as a service. And it allows you to just centrally govern and log all your traffic using like a DevOps approach. This service also allows you to support both application and network level filtering, and it's integrated with Microsoft Threat Intelligence as well. If you want to learn more about these technologies, follow the link at the bottom, aka MS WVD Firewall. See what fits your needs and implement within your environment.
So how do you know that you're doing the right thing? Are you in fact using the recommended configuration? Are you using capabilities of a platform? Did you maybe accidentally open up 3389 anyway, even though you don't need to for WD? Azure Security Center really helps you understand that. You get an overview of all of the controls in your environment, what you're leaving on the table, seriously. So one of the key recommendations that we can call out here is please do look at Security Center, understand what it is that it's telling you. It really helps you up your security game. Azure Defender, the part that we talked about, the Defender part of it is integrated here. We'll give you some alerts and you can make sure that you have a holistic coverage. Azure Security Center and Secure Score will give you that overview of, hey, this is all of the stuff that you're not doing. This is incompliant with policy, you may have said. And then from the VM itself, we get these signals about the configuration as well as Azure Defender or Defender for Endpoint doing its best to surface any and all types of attacks, as well as what I mentioned before, threat vulnerability management will give you that overview of, okay, inside your VM, this is your current state. Outside your VM, this is your environment state. Work on both, make sure that you understand what it is that you're leaving on the table, and then it will actually call out the security best practices for Azure and guide you through that. So the best thing you can do is take a look at this every day and figure out what you need to do next. It will also give you a lot of prioritization there. Key recommendations, go-dos. So that said, now we've gone to environment. Let's dive a little bit deeper on data, on information protection on our next slide, which is where we take a look at what controls do we have available. So let me cover Azure Disk Encryption really quick. This is easy to do. Go ahead and enable it if you haven't. Look at it. It makes a lot of sense. It's also not very exposed. So let's focus on Microsoft Information Protection. Peter mentioned we have a way to stop data from flowing. We have that inside of Microsoft Information Protection as well, but it focuses on that key sensitive information. I might not care too much about this is a test as a string, but I might definitely mind if it's like a social security number or some other secret that I don't want people to share out there. Microsoft Information Protection will allow you to discover where your data is, what kind of data it is, if it does indeed contain anything sensitive, allow you to classify and then protect. So that when it does need to travel, like via email, through one of the Office 365 applications, or from and to the device, or maybe even when a user is logged into Office Online, all of these are areas, touch points where you can say, okay, this is not okay, you shouldn't be doing this, and we go ahead and warn or block you from sharing this sensitive information. Now, bringing it all together on the next slide, just a final glance at our end-to-end. Make sure that you cover all your bases. Look at each of these areas, understand what you can do in this. We already shared Secure Score is a really great way of having that sort of visualization, like this is what you're not doing, this is the best practices. Defender for Endpoint also helps you do that. But in the end of the day, you need to make these changes to your environment to make sure that you stay on the game. So thank you for taking a look at this. Let's go ahead and tell you what the next steps are. We have some really good links that provide matrix of starting points. Like go here, consume the information, make sure that you know what tools are available to you. We talked about basic controls, advanced controls. You will learn about them all in this link. That said, thank you everyone for attending. And Peter, thank you for hosting me.
Thanks, Paul. If there's any remaining questions, we have several subject matter experts attending this session If you have any burning question, don't hesitate, call them out, and we'd be happy to answer. Thanks for your time, everyone.